Welcome to this sample audio clip, which comes from the series entitled Multihull Conversations with Jim Brown. In this recording, Jim speaks to multi-hull sailor and boat builder Roger Hatfield. Roger is the owner of Gold Coast Yachts, which operates on St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. You can find out more about this historic audio series at www.outrigmedia.com.
Hugo was extremely destructive on the island. The well-documented winds approaching and hovering over St. Croix were 140 knots steady state, and the reason St. Croix got so badly hurt was that the eye slowed down and only moved at 2 or 3 knots, where normally the storms, they can't move too fast or they lose power, but if they're moving at about 10 or 11 knots, the eye wall does move past you in an hour or two. But for Hugo, it took 3 or 4 hours, and it was in that period of time where structures just started to fatigue. Things just couldn't stand up to the continual onslaught. And there's some discussion about the storm actually acting like a huge tornado and hitting the island, which is not real tall, but it's hilly, and having to kind of wiggle its way around the island a little bit, because the eye definitely had a little S as it went through, and it devastated the boating community and seriously damaged. I mean, 90% of the homes had bad damage. About 30 or 40% were completely totaled, and so it was quite the experience. And it's well known that a storm at that steady state velocity has wind gusts that'll approach 200. They say 150 knot steady state storm will have wind gusts that go over 215 to 220. So I think there were measurements. It's hard to say what, and there's, it's my analogy for all this is when you live in the mountains or you're living on an island that's mountainous, it's like you're a crawfish in a little stream and somebody comes along with a 5-gallon bucket and dumps it into the stream. And depending on the exact angle of the dump and the pressure of the dump, you could be in a secure spot underneath the rock in one occasion, and on the next occasion you could just get wiped out, because it's almost impossible to predict how the turbulence is going to affect you. But this whole hurricane thing, which is probably one of my better stories, started with the first hurricane that approached when I was in St. Martin on board Mandala. And I anchored, like many other people, out in the lagoon, and after having spent time with Jim Brown talking about, how to deploy sea anchors and what length bridle one should use, and going through all these processes, opted on 2 anchors way out in front in this really long bridle. And the only problem with that was that behind the mountains of St. Martin, which are 1,500 feet and drop off immediately into the lagoon, the wind would be powering on, and then the gust would come, and the gust would have about a 20-degree veer to it. And so now the boat's not lined up for this. And so my little trimaran would get nailed by this and would have to, if it's stretching the line, if it's stretching 300 feet, if I would be backing up 20, 25 feet, and I'd jam the rudder against the back of the boat every single time, and the boat would dig in its the stern of one of the amas, the starboard side, and just go nose up and go jumping across in smooth water, jumping across to try to get to where it needed to be in line with the wind. And it was only 80 knots of wind that was coming through. The gusts may have been higher than that. There was a little Newark trimaran that was right in front of me, and we were keeping our eye on each other. It was pretty amazing, actually. And so survived that, and the second storm came through a week later. And the first one was Hurricane David, and it was well south and did horrible damage to Dominica. And the second one came through a week later was Frederick, and it was an 80-knot storm, but it went right overhead. Well, I said, I'm not going to be in the lagoon. I moved way back in the lagoon into this tiny little basin and got as far away from the mountains as I could. And I had a real short bridle this time, and I put out all four of my anchors on the bridle, put it all into one little thing. And I kicked the rudder off, and I put a little bit of water in the nose of the main hull. And the boat did much better. It oriented more quickly to the gusts, and I sat there, but I got sandblasted by the beach that was nearby, and it ruined that beautiful tan brown color we had on our boat. And the earlier green and white all was showing speckled. But anyway, survived that storm. But I learned a lot from being in two 80-knot storms. So when Hurricane Hugo was approaching on St. Croix, not only was I telling everybody, oh, man, this is going to be horrific because it's the square of the velocity. But, I mean, you got to, and my secretary's going, oh, I think that if the storm's not going to go here, but if the storm gets really bad, I'm going to go there. And I'm going, no, you're not. You're going to go there first and stay there.
Yeah.
And, it was ear-popping stress. It was just, many of my friends spent the night after their houses were demolished climbing down into their cisterns because we all collect their own water and have a swimming pool-like cement basement that's full of water where it's collected in, and they'd all go down in there and stand in 2 or 3 or 4 feet of water all night long because their houses were basically wiped off. There was one couple that lived in this yurt. It was about a 50-foot diameter yurt. I think it was 8-sided structure, and they were just howling wind, not knowing what to do, trying to stay back from the edge of the exposure, and particularly loud gusts came and they ducked behind their sofa or the cabinet or something there, and then all of a sudden it was really different, and the noises were different and everything was different, and they looked up, the whole house, the walls and the roof of this unit had torn it so it wasn't fastened down well enough onto the slab, and the whole thing had lifted up and blown over the top of the hill, and you could see it for a year or two on the other side of the hill. The whole house had blown 300 feet over the top of the hill and down the other side. And so that was probably the most exceptional story, but there were stories that fell in line with that. And
well, the one I remember was about that guy in the little Newark trimaran that actually went flying in the lagoon.
He did. That's Terry Merrigan in the Dick Newark trimaran exit, and he was flipped upside down, and then it kind of tore the water came in, and all of his stuff fell down onto the wet cabin roof, and he's standing up on his roof and trying to collect his stuff, and somehow or another, about 5 minutes later, another gust comes through and flips him back up again, and now the mast which had already bent and torn the tabernacle, now the mast is tearing a hole in the roof, so now he's standing in water in his hull, and his stuff that he just collected is now falling back down the bottom of the hull, and he's trying to decide what to do, and another gust comes and flips him back upside down again. And now he's got a huge hole where the mast was, and things are falling down through this, and he thinks it's got to be over, and then another gust comes and blows the boat up onto land and flips it over on the land and locks him down, and he's in the boat, right side up. He knows he's on land now, and he's petrified. And so he goes up in the forepeak, and he takes the jibs and the sail bags he's got and tries to make himself a little padding and a little safe spot. And he doesn't know that at the same time this Hugo Myers catamaran, Varokane, with these two German guys, has also flipped over in the same little lagoon in Salt River, and somehow stuck its mast into the ground as it flipped over, and the mast stuck there for a couple of years till somebody came and cut it off, sticking up. I mean, really proverbial. And the boat came and landed right next to Terry, and these two guys are scared out of their minds, and they see this little light flashing around, and they decide that what they're going to do, I guess they're in the bushes, and they crawl over to it, and it's Terry inside the bow of his boat through his translucent forward hatch trying to get settled in with the jibs, and these two bloody guys are banging on his hatch door wanting to come in, and Terry's like, what is going on? Help! And he lets these two guys into what he thinks is the most dangerous place he's ever been in his whole life, and the three guys spend the rest of the night there, and then the next day, of course, they examine their demise, and Jim, your son Russ's proa that had been purchased by my partner Rich went well up into the trees there, upside down, and the U.S.'s one of the most famous ocean racers, Jack Pettis with Naga, did a serious flip way up in one of these little trails in the lagoon and was stuck upside down in the mud for weeks. It took weeks before we could figure out how to flip Jack back with no place for any bulldozer or a crane or anything to get into. And I mean, the whole place is a mess. It was incredible how many boats were sunk and torn up and crap everywhere and no leaves anywhere, blades of grass. It's amazing. The one thing that seemed to stand up to it all were the palm fronds, because they must have acted like their primitive ancestors, like some kind of sea fans underwater, blowing and folding into the gusts, because they were able to keep much of their foliage somehow. It's all tattered and torn, but the big trees looked like someone had come along and weed whacked them or trashed, like somebody's fine little garden, someone come in with a huge lawnmower and just crashed through it. And some trees couldn't come back because they're not deciduous. They couldn't come back without their leaf base.
Thanks for listening. To find out more about this historic Multihull audio series, please visit us on the web at www.outrigmedia.com.